Please join me in welcoming Robert Lipovsky.
Thanks. Okay, hello everyone. Thanks for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. So the talk is going to be about the most interesting techniques of two infamous APT groups that I think need no introduction. Over the 12 years that I'm working in ESET at doing malware research, I had the privilege of working with some of the most skilled reverse engineers and threat researchers. So credit goes to them for some of the discoveries that I'll be talking about in the presentation. So before we get to the main scope of the attack, as Katie said, just a really quick introduction about how we use it. So we started augmenting our threat reports, not only with IOCs, but also attack mappings. For example, our We Live Security blog posts. This is what it looks like. And this is just a snippet for this particular example. So the list is much longer, but you can get an idea. So there's the tactic, the technique, and also an inscription how that particular malware uses that technique. Also, for similar reasons and in a similar way, we are mapping attack in our EDR solution, ESET Enterprise Inspector, whenever that was feasible and possible, because there's a varying level of granularity for that. Okay, so those were the external uses for improving the communication with our audiences, whether it's our readers or our users, leveraging the common taxonomy aspect of attack, but we also use it internally as one of the guides for enhancing Enterprise Inspector and improving our analytics. But I won't go into the details about that because you've been hearing all about those things at this conference, or you might have read the attack's great blog posts on these subjects, so they cover that really well. Okay, so let's get to those APTs and those interesting techniques. Of course, this is not going to be a comprehensive listing at all. That will make for a much longer presentation. Just some highlights which I thought were really interesting and noteworthy. So the first group, and because of the lack of time, I just selected one particular software that they were using. That was APT28, or Fancy Bear, or SEDNet. And last year, we found out that they used the first UEFI rootkit found in the wild. So this was a pretty significant deal. Running code from the SPI flash memory, the first thing that runs when you start up your computer, before Windows is loaded, before any security software has a chance to load too, that's a really powerful persistence mechanism and gives the attackers an ability to withstand not only complete wipe of the system, but even a hard drive replacement. So they use this against attacks against in attacks against diplomatic targets in Europe. You can read all of the details in the paper. I'm not going to go into them. I'll just mention that they drew their inspiration from LoJack, which was a legitimate piece of legitimate anti-theft solution for laptops. And in an anti-theft solution, this powerful persistence mechanism makes sense. I mean, if a thief was able to easily get rid of the solution, it wouldn't be a very good anti-theft tool, would it? Okay, so it's featured in attack and listed under the system firmware technique. There are some other examples over there, but basically before LoJacks, UEFI rootkits were mostly in the realm of theoretical proof of concepts or reported, according to leaks, reported functionality of government agencies or the hacking team software. Okay, let's move on to the second group where we'll spend a little bit more time looking at their techniques. And they're known under the umbrella term as sandworm. In our naming, we go into a little bit lower level of granularity, which stems from the way we were tracking them. So the first threat cluster and activities related to that was black energy. I think needs no introduction here, which facilitated their most infamous campaign was that it facilitated the first ever power grid attacks, blackouts caused by a cyber attack. Then there was Indestroyer, also referred to some folks as crash override. This was I would say, one of the most cunning pieces of malware we ever revealed. And the reason is that not just it's modular, but it's able to communicate with industrial control systems hardware using their very own language. It had an implementation of 4 different industrial protocols. So effectively, this malware was bridging the gap between IT and OT attacks. We also saw a shift from black energy to what we call telebots at some time. So there were a lot of things in common, like shared infrastructure, but the malware was different. The reason why we called it that was because they were using the Telegram API for command and control communication. And not only the tools changed, but also the focus. So it's really hard to conclusively say that they are exactly the same people, the same group behind it. And the focus shifted from critical infrastructure and the energy sector towards the financial sector. And their most famous attack, which spread beyond the borders of Ukraine worldwide, was, of course, NotPetya. And in parallel to the telebots activity, there was also gray energy, which we consider the successor of black energy, staying with that original focus of critical infrastructure and energy companies, and still active until today. So that was just a quick overview of that group, and let's take a look at the techniques that they were using. So for initial access, they were mostly using spear phishing. That's unsurprising, with various methods of gaining execution, whether it was pure social engineering, or they were also using exploits, even 0 days. But let's get to the more interesting and not that common stuff. So they did supply chain compromises. The NotPetya, starting off from the infection of MEDOC, so from a MEDOC backdoor, as we call it, that's the most widely known example, but there were also other cases. Another interesting technique was used by Gray Energy, and that was exploiting a public-facing application. Specifically, it was trying to gain entry inside the network via a vulnerable web server. And a couple of other interesting, notable techniques by this group. There were black energy plugins that were abusing TeamViewer, so targeting specific versions of TeamViewer, changing the settings to enable a backdoor and remote unattended access to that infected machine. Even so, basically, the ability to regain entry even after all their other tools were detected and cleaned off the system. Another black energy plugin, which acted as a parasitic infector. This was really interesting because we don't see a lot of these virus-like malware a lot nowadays. So we saw some Juniper installers circulating in the wild that were infected by this plugin. And the third example I want to mention, I guess the ICX people in the room will recognize this. That was execution via HMI. So in this particular example, it was targeting Simplicity HMI, but there were also others that were targeted, such as WinCC. So that script that you saw over there, that would be launched by Simplicity in this case, and it would run the first stage of black energy. So the details about this are described in this ICS advisory, so you can go there and check out the details if you want. This is interesting because this was one of the first indicators that this group had an interest in critical infrastructure and ICS. This was, of course, before the blackouts actually happened. Speaking of, let's talk about impact, because if I were to describe this group with just one word, I would call them impactful for the havoc they caused in Ukraine, whether it was with the blackouts, which left hundreds of thousands of people without electricity, or with the pseudo-ransomware NotPetya going beyond the borders and affecting some of the world's largest corporations. Let's take a look at the in-destroyer impact. So the primary one, of course, was the ability to de-energize that substation. And it was doing that, as I already mentioned, by sending commands to these types of devices, protection relays, effectively opening circuit breakers and speaking the language of these devices. So that's an important thing to say. So there were no exploits. There were no software vulnerabilities involved in this. Vulnerabilities, however, were involved in the second type of functionality that affected the operations at that workstation, and that was carried out by the denial of service component. This also went after the protection relays, and it was abusing a fault that was using a vulnerability, not a zero-day because it was patched already at the time, but not in those particular cases, and it would render the protection relays unresponsive. And the third impact, although if we were to consider the upcoming ICS attack, it would probably be classified a little bit differently in a different level of granularity. But basically, the third way that industry affected the operation of an electrical substation was through the data wiper component. So that one did not go after the protection relays, but after the HMIs used to control and monitor them. And the purpose of that was to amplify the impact, to make recovery from the attack more difficult. So wipers, these destructive components, are kind of a signature thing of this group. We observed an evolution of this through the years that we were tracking them, from the black energy plugins through standalone kill disk components to file encryptors, disruptive file encryptors masquerading as ransomware, most notably NotPetya, but there were also others before that that had the same basic idea. And they even, in some cases, in some variants, they even threw a little bit of a prank intended to intimidate the victims. So any Mr. Robot fans here, you'll probably recognize this. Okay, so to finish off the talk, it's great that attack is evolving. When we first started using it and contributing, the one tactic that was direly missing was impact. So we're really happy that that was added. If I were to predict future expansion, I would say that we can probably expect even more criminal types of impacts being added, as we're already seeing the boundaries between threat types and motivations already becoming very blurred. So with that, I thank you for listening. Use, attack, and contribute. Thank you.